The heat came off the flight line in sheets that morning, and Nadia Pratt sat on the tail ramp of a parked bird with a signals receiver open across her knees, threading a coil of antenna wire between two fingers the way another woman might work a rosary. The others called the box a paperweight. She called it a friend. She had not said more than 40 words since the convoy rolled in 3 days ago, and the men had already decided what the silence meant, which was fine by her, because Grandpa Emmett used to say that a quiet radio catches more than a loud one. And Nadia had been quiet her whole life and had caught a great deal. A staff sergeant named Doss walked past and knocked twice on the top of her receiver without slowing down. "Still listening to the birds chirp, Pratt?" "Still listening," she said. He laughed like that settled something and kept walking toward the operations tent where the men who mattered stood around the map. Nadia watched him go, then went back to the wire. On the little screen in front of her, a signal she had been tracking for 2 days ticked up out of the noise floor and sat there, steady, patient, the same 3-second pulse it always sent at this hour. Nobody else on the base had noticed it. She had noticed it the first night. She had not told anyone yet, because Emmett also used to say, "You don't call a thing until you know its whole shape," and she was still learning the shape of this one. She wrote the time down in a notebook and pencil. 19 years old, the roster said. First deployment. Attached from a signals detachment nobody had heard of, and she let all of it stand uncorrected because none of it was the part that mattered. The part that mattered was the pulse. 6 days from now, she would walk down out of a valley on her own 2 feet, alone, carrying the one piece of proof that would make 11 men believe every word she had ever said. And she did not know that yet. And she folded the notebook shut and slid it into her breast pocket and kept threading the wire. "If you stay with me to the end of this one, I promise you a moment near the finish, where she comes walking out of that valley with the thing in her hands that turns every doubter in the place to stone. So hit subscribe, tell me down in the comments what city you're listening from tonight, and settle in, because the quiet ones are always the ones worth waiting on." The skill came from a screened back porch in East Texas and a man who fixed radios for a living and never once raised his voice. Emmett Pratt had run a repair shop off the highway for 40 years. Televisions and CB rigs and the big farm radios ranchers used to call their hands in from the far fences, and he had raised his granddaughter in the smell of hot solder and dust. She was small even then, the kind of small that made teachers speak slowly to her, and Emmett never did. He handed her a soldering iron at 8 and a signal tracer at 10, and taught her that every wire in the world was trying to tell you something if you were willing to be still enough to hear it. The lesson that stayed with her came from a July afternoon when she was 12. A rancher had brought in a base station that would not receive, and Emmett had let her work it alone while he watched from the doorway with his arms folded. She checked the antenna, the power, the squelch, everything the manual said, and found nothing. She was ready to call it dead. "You're listening for the voice," Emmett said. "That's your trouble. Stop listening for the voice and listen for the carrier underneath it. A dead set and a quiet set sound the same to a fool. They don't sound the same to you." She had turned the gain all the way up and closed her eyes, and there it was, under the hiss, the faint breathing hum of a carrier wave, with no voice riding it. The set wasn't dead. Somebody 30 miles out was keying up without talking, holding the line open, too scared or too hurt to speak. She had found a stranded man that afternoon by the sound of his silence, and Emmett had put one dry hand on the top of her head and said nothing, which from him was everything. Listen for the carrier underneath. She had carried that sentence into a recruiting office at 18. Over Emmett's objections, he had wanted her to take the shop, wanted it badly, had a sign half-painted with her name under his, and she had gone anyway, into a job the Army barely had a name for, finding people by the shape of what they transmitted. There was a letter in her cargo pocket that she had not answered. Emmett had written it in his shaky block print 2 months back, and it did not mention the shop, and did not mention the sign, which was how she knew he was still hurt about both. He had written about the weather, and his knees, and a dog that had wandered up to the porch, and at the bottom he had written, "Come see the porch. When you're back, I've got something to give you that won't fit in an envelope." And she had read that line a dozen times, and could not decide if it was a peace offering or a guilt trip, and so she had done nothing, which was the one thing she was good at doing wrong. She kept the letter folded in her pocket, where she would feel it every time she reached for her notebook. And every time she felt it, she thought, "I'll write him tonight." And every night she listened to the pulse instead. The base sat in a bowl of dry mountains, all rock and thorn brush and wind that switched direction twice a day, and Nadia learned its noise the way she learned every place, by sitting still in it. The convoy had come up to reinforce a fire base that watched a single long valley running east into higher ground, and the men here had been in country 8 months and wore that like a closed door. She was new, and new was enough to be nothing to them. Doss made sport of her, the first real time in the chow tent, loud, with an audience. "Hey, everybody clear a path. The antenna's coming through." He said it grinning as she carried her tray past. "You know we got actual signals, guys, right? Grown ones. What did you do to get sent up here? Lose a bet?" A couple of the 8-month men laughed the easy laugh of people who have decided they are safe. Nadia set her tray down 2 seats away and ate without answering. And the not answering bothered Doss more than any comeback would have. She could see it working on him across the tent. But there was a contractor on the base, a broad, quiet civilian named Hollis Vance, who ran the communications shelter and had been in these mountains, on and off, for 22 years, across 3 different companies, and one uniform he never talked about. He watched her the second night, when the pulse came up on the big rack, and everyone else was asleep. She had drifted into his shelter because she couldn't sleep, and the equipment was the only company she trusted. And she had reached past his shoulder and retuned his own receiver a hair, and pulled the pulse up out of the noise where he had been staring straight through it for 2 days. "There," she said, 3-second interval. "Been running since I got here." Vance looked at the screen for a long moment. "I had that as terrain bounce." "It's not bounce. Bounce wanders. This one keeps time." She traced the little peak with her fingernail. "Somebody's keying a beacon and pretending it's nothing. That's a lot of discipline for nothing." Vance turned in his chair and really looked at her then. The way you look at a tool you assumed was junk and just watched cut clean. "How old are you?" "Old enough to hear a carrier under a hiss," she said. And Vance almost smiled, and from that night on he left the second chair in his shelter, empty in a way that meant it was hers. She was not only the quiet one either. 3 nights in, a generator crew had a card game going behind the fuel point, and Vance waved her over. And it turned out she could count cards without seeming to, and had a dust-dry way of calling a man's bluff that took the whole crew apart laughing. She cleaned out a mechanic named Pruitt, 2 hands running, and told him, flat as a level, that he tapped his boot every time he lied, and that his boot had been talking louder than his mouth all night. Pruitt put his head down on the ammo crate they were using for a table and groaned, and even Doss, passing, snorted before he caught himself. For half an hour, the tent forgot she was the antenna, and just liked her, and she let them, because Emmett had taught her that being easy to sit with was its own kind of listening. Pruitt was the one who saw the other thing, though he could never have told you what he saw. It was the next afternoon, and a comms line into the operations tent had gone dead, and 2 of the 8-month signalers were up on a pole tracing it foot by foot in the heat, sweating and cursing. Nadia walked past, stopped, tilted her head at the wire the way you'd tilt your head at a sound, and said, "It's the 3rd connector back," under the tape, where the jackets chafed on the bracket. She said it without a meter in her hand, just from the way the line hung and where the sun had been cooking it, and she kept walking. Pruitt climbed up and peeled the tape, and there it was, the chafed connector, exactly there. He stood on the pole with the wire in his hand, and could not have said, if you'd asked him, how a person knows a thing like that without touching it. It stuck with him. He almost mentioned it a dozen times over the next 2 days and never found the words. The valley broke open at dusk on the 6th day, and it did not come as a call in the night. It came as a silence where a sound should have been. A patrol had gone east that morning, 11 men under a lieutenant named Cray, up the long valley to check a village that had gone quiet on the district net. They were due to check in at 1800. 1800 came, and the net stayed empty. 1815, empty. Nadia was in Vance's shelter when the operations officer came in, fast asking why he had nothing, and she was already leaning into the rack, already turning the gain up, already listening for the carrier under the hiss. 11 men, the operations officer said, to Vance, not to her. 11, and I can't raise one of them. Their last position was the village. Give me anything. She heard it before Vance did. Under the empty net, faint, keyed, and silent, the same discipline as her pulse. Somebody out there was holding a handset open and not speaking. 11 men had gone up the valley, and something had closed over them, and one of them was doing the only thing he could, which was breathe into an open line and pray somebody was still enough to hear it. The fire base commander was a major named Ellison, a careful man who had read Nadia's file the fast way everyone read it, and had slotted her to monitor a backup net and stay out of the way. He stood now in Vance's shelter with 11 men missing and the district net dead, and the higher headquarters 2 hours of bad road away. And he looked at the small, quiet girl, who had her eyes closed and her hand on the gain. "You had a signal you didn't report," Ellison said. "It came out harder than he meant." "I reported it to the equipment," Nadia said, eyes still shut. It was the only thing listening. She opened her eyes. "It's not a beacon. I had that wrong. It's a repeater, a relay somebody set up in the high ground to bounce their own traffic over the ridge. It's been running 6 days. Whoever took your patrol has been using it the whole time to talk across that valley, and right now, under it, One of your men has a handset keyed open and is not making a sound." Ellison stared at her. It cost him something to say the next part, and he said it in front of the operations officer and Vance both, which cost him more. "I put you on a backup net because I read one line of your file and quit. That was my mistake, and those are my men. Can you find them?" "I can find the relay," she said, already pulling her receiver off the bench and slinging it. "The relay talks to whoever's holding them. I find the relay. I find the traffic. The traffic tells me where they're sitting. But I have to get up high enough to hear both ends, and the only place high enough is the North Spur." She was checking her wire, her spare battery, the notebook in her breast pocket, all of it, the way Emmett checked a bench before a job. "Somebody's got to walk me up the spur and then leave me there to work. I can't do it and cover myself both." "Take Doss," Ellison said. "Take Vance," she said. "Doss thinks I'm an antenna. Vance knows what I am." And Vance was already reaching for his rifle. Her first words on the command net then, keyed clean and level as she started up toward the spur. "Command, this is Pratt. Moving to the North Spur to localize the relay. Keep the net clear and keep the patrol's channel open. Do not transmit on it. If he's keying silent, I don't want us stepping on him. Out. 11 men." She said the number to herself once and then put it away, because you do not carry a number. Up a mountain, you carry the work. The North Spur was a long rib of broken rock that ran up out of the base perimeter into the dark. And Vance went first with the rifle, and she went second with the receiver. And the wind came down the spur in gusts that snatched at the antenna wire she was trying to feed out as she climbed. That was the first problem. At the base, the pulse had been steady, but up here, in the wind, the relay's signal fluttered as the gusts moved the brush between her and it. And she had to learn the rhythm of the wind before she could trust the meter, lying flat behind a boulder for a full minute reading the gusts, while Vance watched the dark and the men down below waited. "Command, Pratt. I have the relay. Strong. It's up the valley, high, maybe 4 kilometers, on the south wall." She was sketching in her notebook by red light, the ridge line, the angle, the fall of the signal. "It's relaying 2 stations, one close to it, one further, lower, in the valley floor. The lower one's where the patrol is. The traffic between them is your kidnappers coordinating. Give me time, and I'll pull the lower station's position out of the difference." "How much time?" Ellison's voice, tight. "Emmett time," she said, not meaning to say it aloud. And then, "An hour, maybe less. The relay does half my work for me. It just doesn't know it." The second problem came 20 minutes in. The relay changed its interval. For 6 days it had kept a 3-second beat, and now, as full dark settled, it dropped to a fast, irregular chatter. And the whole character of the traffic changed. More stations, more keying, a jump in the discipline of it. Something down in that valley was about to happen, and it was about to happen on a clock she couldn't see. "They're massing," Vance said quietly, reading her face by the red light. "That's not coordination anymore. That's a go order net. They're going to move the patrol, or they're going to finish it," Nadia said, and her mouth was dry. "Either way, they do it soon." She bent back over the receiver. She had a bearing to the relay and a bearing to the far low station, but 2 bearings from one spot gave her a line, not a point, and a line 4 kilometers long in that broken country was no good to anybody. She needed a second position to cross the bearing and there was no time to move, and no one to send. Then she found it, the thing that was hers, the thing that was in this place, and no other. The relay on the south wall was not just passing traffic. It was a cheap, directional set, and every few minutes it swung. She could hear its signal strength rise and fall in a slow sweep, as whoever tended it re-aimed it between the close station and the far one. It was aiming itself back and forth, and each time it aimed at the far low station where the patrol was, its signal peaked in a particular direction she could measure. She didn't need two positions. She needed to let the relay point for her. Vance, listen. She was talking fast now, low and clear, working it out loud so it would be real. The relay swings to talk to each end. When it swings to talk to the patrol's guards, it aims right at them. It has to make the link. I can hear the exact second it peaks on that bearing, because that's when its signal to me is bouncing cleanest off the same wall it's using to reach them. I take my bearing to the relay, and I take my bearing at the instant it aims down valley. And where those two lines cross, that's not a guess. That's where the relay is pointing, and the relay's pointing at your men. The relay's doing the survey. I'm just reading its answer. You can hear it aim, Vance said, slow, like he was making sure. Emmett taught me to hear a set breathe. This one's breathing right at them every 90 seconds. She had the red light down on the notebook, the two lines drawn, the wind pushing at the page. I need 3 good swings to be sure, 90 seconds each. Keep me alive 4.5 minutes. Down the net, a new voice broke in, and it was Doss, back at the base, and there was no grin in it at all. Pratt, this is Doss on the relay backup. I got movement on the valley floor cameras, thermal, a lot of it, moving toward the patrols last known. You do not have 4 minutes. You might have 2. She keyed her handset. Cray, Lieutenant Cray, if you can hear me, key twice, just twice. I have you. Help is coming. Key twice. She set it into the patrol's silent channel against her own rule because she had to know he was alive to save, and then she let go and listened. And the channel hissed, empty. 1 second. 2, 3, 4. Nothing came back. 5, 6. She had heard that silence before, on a July porch, and it had been a stranded man too scared to speak. And it had also, other times, been a dead set, and a dead set, and a quiet set sound the same to a fool. 7, 8. Her stomach dropped through the mountain. 9. 2 clicks, faint, keyed by a hand that could barely move. He's alive, she breathed. He's alive. They're alive. Hold on. And she bent back to the relay and made herself stop feeling anything and start counting swings. The first swing came, and she caught the peak clean, marked the bearing, drew the line. 90 seconds of the longest waiting of her life, Vance breathing beside her, the thermal count climbing on Doss's screen 4 kilometers away. The second swing came, and it peaked a hair off the first, and she took the average the way Emmett had taught her to average a wandering needle. Trust the middle, discard the flinch. The third swing came late. The wind gusted and dragged the brush, and for a horrible 10 seconds the signal smeared, and she thought she'd lost it. And then it cleared and peaked, and she had her third line, and all 3 crossed inside a circle she could have covered with her hand. Command, Pratt. I have them. Her voice did not shake, and she would never afterward know how. Grid follows. The patrol is on the valley floor, south side, in a dry irrigation cut below the village, at the base of the south wall directly under the relay. 11. I have no count. Assume 11. The force closing on them is coming down the wadi from the north. If you're putting anything in the air or on the ground, they come in from the east, low, using the south wall to mask, because the relay and every set these people own is aimed the other way. They are all looking north and up. Nothing they have is listening east and low. I can promise you that, because I'm the one who's been listening to what they're listening with. There was a pause on the net, and then Ellison's voice changed. Say again your confidence. Total, Nadia said. Send them east and low. I'll talk them in off the relay's own aim. The enemy built me a map and pointed it at their own hostages. All I did was read it. The relief came in from the east, low, 2 birds hugging the south wall exactly as she called it, and she lay on the north spur, 4 kilometers off, with the receiver against her cheek, and talked them down the last mile by the relay's own swings, telling them when the enemy net was aimed away and when it swung back, threading the aircraft through the 90-second gaps in the enemy's own attention, like feeding wire between 2 fingers. She heard the far-off cough of the door guns open up down in the valley, small and flat with distance, and then the higher crackle of rifles, and then a long stretch where she could only listen and pray and read the traffic falling apart on the enemy net as their coordination came unglued. Then Doss on the net, wrecked and plain. Pratt, they're on the ground with the patrol. They got 'em, all of 'em. They're loading 'em up. She closed her eyes. On the screen, the relay was still keying, fainter now, its tenders dead or run off, and she reached out with her fingernail and traced its dying pulse one more time. And then it stopped, and the valley on her meter went as quiet as the July porch, and she let herself, for 1 second, feel all of it. They brought the patrol back through the base perimeter at first light, walking and carried 11 men who had gone up the valley and come back down it. And Nadia came down off the north spur, stiff and hollow, with the receiver banging against her hip, and Vance behind her, and she got to the aid station as the medics were working the worst of them. The worst of them was Lieutenant Cray. He had a wound low in the side from the first ambush, and had lain in that irrigation cut for 11 hours, keying a handset with the only 2 fingers he could still move, and he was gray and shaking and awake, which was the bad kind of awake. Nadia went down on her knees in the dust beside his litter, and the hands that had threaded antenna wire in the wind all night were suddenly doing something else, holding a battle dressing hard against his side where a medic needed a third hand, leaning her small weight into it steady and careful, the same patience she'd given the meter, now given to a man's blood. "You're the one," Cray said. His voice was thread. "On the radio. You told me to key twice. I'm the one. Don't talk. Save your air." But he wasn't going to save his air. They never did, the scared awake ones. "My wife's having our first. Any day. That's why I kept keying. I kept thinking, I got to be on that porch. I promised her I'd be on that porch when he was crying without the strength to make it look like crying. Am I going to make it? Tell me straight. You seem like you tell it straight." Nadia looked at the medic. The medic met her eyes half a second and gave the smallest nod. Pressure holding. Pulse there, bird inbound. "You're going to make it," Nadia said. "Not I hope. Not maybe." She said it flat and certain, the way Emmett said a set was fixable before he'd fixed it, because saying it was the first part of making it true. You've got a hole in your side, and a helicopter 10 minutes out, and a wife who's going to hand you a baby on a porch. That's what's real. Hold the porch in your head and breathe. You promise? I don't promise. I'm telling you the shape of it. Now breathe, Lieutenant. In through the nose. They lifted him onto the bird 10 minutes later, and he was still breathing when it went up. And he found her face in the crowd and mouthed something she couldn't hear over the rotors and didn't need to. The investigating officer came up the bad road 2 days later because a 19-year-old augmentee on a backup net was not supposed to have localized an enemy relay, cross-fixed a hostage position off its own antenna sweep, and talked 2 aircraft through a masked approach, and the file and the facts would not sit in the same chair. His name was Major Lund, and his uniform had never been near the valley, and he set up in the operations tent with her file and a list of questions built to find the lie. "Walk me through it slowly," Lund said, not unkind, tapping the file. "You cross-fixed a target off a single observation position. That requires 2 positions. Basic. You had 1. Explain to me how 1 position gives you a fix." "The relay gave me the 2nd position," Nadia said. "It was a directional set. It swung to aim at each station it served. Every time it aimed at the patrol's guards, I could measure the bearing it was pointing, because its own signal to me peaked when it did. Its aim was my second line. I read the answer off the enemy's own equipment." Lund looked at her the way he'd looked at a lot of inflated stories. "You expect me to write that a relay conducted your survey for you. I expect you to write what happened. Contractor Vance was lying next to me and heard every swing. The recordings on my receiver are time-stamped against the aircraft track. Overlay them." She leaned in, and for the first time, something warm came into her voice, the plain pleasure of a true thing. "You keep doing the math with my age, Major. Do it with the physics instead. A directional antenna points where it's talking. If you know where it is, and you know the instant it aims, you know what it's aiming at. I didn't need to be old for that to be true. I just needed to be listening when everybody else quit." Lund was quiet a moment. He looked at the file, then at her, and the two would not reconcile. And he knew, sitting there, which one he'd been sent to doubt and which one was real. "Vance confirms all of it," he said. Not a question now. "Ask him. Ask the 2 crews I talked in. Ask Lieutenant Cray when he's out of surgery and off the porch." She stood because the business was done, and Emmett had taught her not to sit in a finished room. "The record and the person don't match because you built the record out of 1 line. Read the whole file. It comes out even." At the tent flap, Lund said to her back, "Who taught you to hear a set aim?" Nadia stopped. Something moved across her face he couldn't see. "My grandfather," she said, and went out into the light. It was Doss in the end, who sat with her in the dark, and neither of them planned it. She couldn't sleep. That had started, the coming awake at 3 with the valley gone silent, on a meter behind her eyes. That particular quiet of a set that has stopped keying. And she'd taken to sitting against the cool sandbag wall of the comms shelter where the bass noise thinned out. Doss found her there because he couldn't sleep either. And he stood a second like he'd keep walking, then sat down a careful distance off and said nothing for a long while. "I keep hearing it stop," Nadia said finally, into the dark, and she told no one this. "The relay. When its people died or ran, it just kept keying a while, and then it stopped. And that's the sound I come up out of sleep hearing. Not the guns. The stop. A line going quiet that was talking a second ago. She turned her head. You spend your life learning to hear things, and then you hear one thing you can't stop hearing. Doss was quiet. Then, you know what I keep hearing? Me. In the chow tent. Clear a path. The antenna's coming through. He dragged a hand down his face. 11 men come down that valley alive. And the reason it's 11, and not a story we tell at a memorial, is a kid I called a paperweight. To her face. For a laugh. He shook his head slowly. That's not about you. That one's mine to keep. You did the work. I get to keep the picture of what I was doing with my mouth while you did it. You were funny, Nadia said. Some of it landed. Don't be decent about it. That's worse. But there was no heat in it. He looked out at the Black Mountains. 19 years I'd have bet the file. Read one line. Filed you under nothing. I've been doing this long enough I should know better, and I didn't. Nadia let it sit. The wind came down the spur and turned around and went back up. My grandfather taught me the sets, she said. He's got a shop in Texas, had a sign half painted with my name on it, wanted me to take it over. I went and did this instead. He wrote me 2 months ago and asked me to come see the porch. Said he's got something to give me that won't fit in an envelope. And I've been carrying the letter around not answering it. Because I don't know if it's forgiveness or a hook. It came out flat and low. She hadn't decided to say it. I told a dying man the exact shape of his future with total confidence, and I can't write 4 lines to the man who taught me how. Doss turned and looked at her. So go see the porch. It's not the porch. I know it's not the porch. He said it gently, which a week ago she'd have sworn was beyond him. You think if you don't answer it, the clock doesn't start. It's already started. My dad went while I was still deciding whether I was done being mad at him. He got up slow, brushed the dust off. You get to decide later what it all meant. But later only works if there's a later, and yours still has one in it. Don't waste the thing I don't have. He went in. Nadia sat against the shelter until the sky grayed in the east. And somewhere in there she stopped telling herself she'd write. Because Doss was right, and it had never been the letter. It was the porch. It was the thing that wouldn't fit in an envelope, which she'd known the whole time was the shop, the sign, the 40 years of hot solder. Emmett wanted to hand her before his hands quit. He hadn't asked her to write. He'd asked her to come. Nobody handed her the answer. Vance didn't have it, and Lund didn't have it, and there was no line in the letter that solved it. She just decided, sitting in the gray light. The way you finally decide a thing you've carried so long, it's worn a groove. She'd finish the tour. Then she'd go to the porch and let Emmett give her whatever wouldn't fit in the envelope. And she'd take the shop, or she wouldn't, but she'd sit in it with him and let him show her the thing he'd been waiting to show her, because some sets stop keying and you don't get a second recording. And Emmett had spent her whole childhood teaching her exactly that, and she'd been the last to hear it. Doss came to her 2 days before they rotated out, and he did it in daylight where men could see, which was the point. He'd gone to Ellison first, she learned that later, and put it on the record, in writing, that his conduct toward her in the first week had been unprofessional and wrong, and he wanted it in his own file, not hers. It cost him a formal note he didn't have to earn. He did it before he ever came to say a word. Then he came and said the word. He found her coiling antenna wire, laying it in loops the way she always did. And he stood there with his hands not knowing where to go. "I said things," Doss started, and stopped, and started again, because an apology that has to climb over a man's whole idea of himself doesn't come out clean. Loud, where people heard, to get the room. And you were the best one on this base the whole time, and I made you a punchline, because that was easier than... He stopped. "I'm sorry. That's it. I'm sorry, and I put it in writing, so it's real, and not just a thing I said in the dark." Nadia set the coil down. She looked at him a moment, and Emmett was in her somewhere. Emmett, who didn't waste words, or do cheap grace, or kick a man who'd already done the hard part himself. "You showed up," she said. 2 words. Not, "it's fine," because it hadn't been, and not nothing, because he'd earned more than nothing. He'd shown up twice now, once in the dark and once in the light, and that was the true thing she had to give him. Doss nodded like that was more than he'd hoped and less than he'd feared, which was exactly right, and left her to the wire. The call came through the base's one good line, 4 days after they pulled back to the rear. And the runner who came to find her said only that there was a woman on the phone, asking for her by a description because she didn't have a name. The girl on the radio, the young one. And Nadia went not knowing which end of the Cray family it would be. It was the wife. A voice worn down to the grain, calling from a hospital corridor a world away. "They told me a girl on a radio found my husband," she said. "They gave me a lot of words. Relay and crossfix, and I don't know what any of it means. I just know he was gone, and then he wasn't. He called me from the hospital. First thing he said, before hello, he said there was a girl on the radio, told him he was going to be on the porch when the baby came." The voice broke all the way through. "She was born yesterday. He was there. He was on the porch with the phone. He made it to the porch. Because you told him he would, and he believed you so hard, he stayed alive to do it." Nadia stood holding the phone, and for the first time in the whole thing, she didn't have the next thing ready. She'd had a shape for a dying man, and an answer for a major, and 2 words for Doss, and she had nothing for this. For a woman in a corridor, undone by a birth, and she felt her throat close and her eyes go hot, and she let it happen, standing there, because there was nothing else to do with it. "I didn't do anything," she managed, and it came out wrong and wet. "I held a dressing and I read a meter. He kept himself alive. He kept 2 fingers moving for 11 hours. That was him. He said you don't promise things. He said you tell people the shape." "I don't promise things," Nadia said, and had to stop, and the woman waited. And the 2 of them stayed on the line, across all that distance not saying anything, which was somehow the truest call she'd had all year. Vance put it plainest, at the end, the way she'd half known it would be Vance. It was the morning they broke down the last of the shelter, and he handed her a coffee she hadn't asked for, same as the first night he left her the chair, and they stood and looked at the mountains. "Couldn't have told you what I saw that second night," Vance said. "You pulling that pulse up out of my own rack where I'd stared through it for 2 days. Knew it was something. Didn't have the words." He drank. "Got 'em now." "Yeah? Everybody up here listens for the voice," Vance said. "The traffic, the order, the thing being said. You showed up and listened for the set underneath it. The machine nobody thought was talking. That's the whole thing, isn't it? That's what your grandfather taught you. You don't listen to what they're saying. You listen to what they're saying it with. Nadia looked at him, and something in her chest went loose. Because that was Emmett's whole life in one sentence out of a contractor's mouth 10,000 miles from the porch, and she'd never once been able to say it that plain herself. "That's it," she said. "That's the whole thing." 14 months later, there was solder smoke on a screened back porch in East Texas, and Nadia sat at Emmett's bench with a farm radio open in front of her and her grandfather beside her. His hands too unsteady now to hold the iron, but his ear still good, still catching things hers missed. She had come home. The tour ended, and she hadn't signed the next one, and there'd been a career counselor who couldn't understand why somebody with her file would walk, and she hadn't fully explained, because some things you decide and don't argue. The thing that wouldn't fit in the envelope had been the shop, of course. Emmett had walked her out back the first evening and shown her the sign. Finished now, her name under his in his own careful hand, Pratt and Pratt. And he'd said he wasn't asking her to take it. He was asking her to sit in it with him while he still could, and she'd taken it anyway, both the sitting and the shop, and they ran it together now. The ranchers still coming in from the far fences with sets that wouldn't receive. Cray had made it, all the way. She knew because he'd written an actual letter, and in it he said his daughter had learned to walk on that porch, and that he'd hung a bird feeder off the rail so she'd have something to point at, and that some evenings he sat out there and just listened to the quiet on purpose now. The way you'd savor a thing you almost lost. Doss had made Master Sergeant and gone to an instructor billet, teaching young signalers, and he'd sent her a photo of his first class with a line on the back, "None of 'em get the paperweight speech," and she'd laughed out loud alone in the shop and pinned it over the bench where it still was. The thing the valley left in her was still there. She noticed it that afternoon when the shop radio, tuned to nothing, dropped its carrier for half a second between stations and went to dead air, and her whole body stilled and her hand stopped on the iron, and for one breath she was back on the North Spur, with a set going quiet under her fingers and 11 men she couldn't hear anymore. It passed. It always passed. Emmett, whose eyes were on his own hands, heard the iron stop hissing against the joint, and knew without looking. "You went out," he said. "I came back," she said. "You always do." He turned his head toward the dead air hiss, then toward her. "A line goes quiet, and you go up a mountain in your head. I don't have to see it to know it's happening." He nudged the radio a hair toward her. "That's all right. The ones who don't hear the quiet, those are the ones I'd worry over." They sat there a while, the old man who'd taught her to hear a set breathe, and the young woman who'd hear it now for both of them. And then a rancher's truck pulled up out front with a base station in the bed that wouldn't key, and Nadia wiped her hands and went out into the low gold light to meet it. She stood on the porch steps a moment before she went down, level-eyed and easy, the wire coiled in her hand, out of habit, and she listened the way she always listened now, to the whole quiet country and everything in it that was trying to say something under the hush. The truck ticking as it cooled, the wind in the screen, the far radios out past the fences, waiting on somebody still enough to hear them. Then she went down the steps into the light and crossed to the truck, at peace, having given the porch back the one person left who knew how to hear what it wanted, and settled in to fix the thing that wouldn't talk.